Okay, here's a quick podcast lecture on political economy. So remember, we talked once again. Go back to one of the first lectures where I showed you that sort of tripartite division between the state, civil society, and the market. Well, we've talked about the state. You did a paper on the state. We talked a little bit about civil society, and now this is the market. Okay, so this is in which individuals come together to decide essentially. To sell and to buy things from each other, and what's important about political economy is how politics enters into that equation. In other words, the relationship between the market and the state, and also between civil society and the market. So I won't tell you, this is right from O'Neill. This is just a definition of what political economy is. So what is the correct relationship between the state and the market? In other words, how much which should have precedence, the state or the market. How should they relate to each other? How should they connect with each other? Which should be stronger? And the answers to those are different, not only across countries but within countries. Actually, I'll give you a link to a very good speech that Barack Obama made on just this question on Wall Street a couple of months ago, and it sets out his sort of vision of the correct relationship between the state and the market. Okay, so what is the role of civil society here? Remember, we talked about we read an article by Alesina and his co-author on the role of the family, right, and family values in the economy and the market. So this is an example. So as I said, there's different views between different countries, leading to different political economic systems. Okay, so markets and property. Market is just supply and demand. What's important about market is that resources are allocated through what's called a price mechanism. So the price mechanism essentially tells you how much to buy and how much to either demand or how much to produce. Great example right now is how the price mechanism is changing Americans' behavior with respect to driving as a result of the price of gas. Okay, so that's increased dramatically over the last year or so, actually over the last couple of years, and it's created a different incentive for Americans. Okay, so property, the public good. Public good is important. It's a good provided by the state, right, for all of society to use, right? These are some examples, and really a key component of the public good is what's called non-excludability, which means that once a public good is provided, nobody can be excluded from using it, right? So, for instance, if the U.S. military, the U.S. government is providing, military defense of the country, well, if you're a member, if you're in this country, you don't even have to be a citizen, in fact. If that good is provided, military defense, then you are partaking of it. Okay, that's sort of no one can exclude you from actually using or benefiting from that public good. Okay, so how are public goods and other social expenditures paid for? Well, obviously taxation. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, former justice, has argued that taxes the dues we pay for civilization. Okay, now as we see, there are different taxation rates in different countries, right? From very high in Sweden to much lower in Mexico, the United States, and Japan, etc. Okay, so these are total tax receipts as a percentage of GDP. Money, inflation, and unemployment. Money and inflation, we know what these are essentially. Unemployment. What's important about the link between, say, inflation and unemployment is this what's called the Phillips curve. And for a long time, there's this belief that there's an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation, and different political parties and different countries. In fact, the argument was that they could choose to either have lower inflation and higher unemployment, or vice versa. So there was this inverse relationship between the two. Okay, so here's an example of the Phillips curve. There is something, I think this is actually over time in the United States. So as the unemployment rate rises, then inflation drops, and vice versa. Okay, regulation, don't worry about that. There's some contributors, that's from your book. And so we have different political economic systems. We have liberalism, which is classical liberalism, which is not the liberalism we talk about here in the United States, but it's really about laissez-faire, which means leave to do. In other words, leave the market alone. Very little government involvement, and it's sort of what's considered conservative here in the United States. But it's classical liberalism. It goes back to classical liberalism of the British, like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and others, John Stuart Mill, and then the French physiocrats. Then we have social democracy, which is what we see in Western Europe, where we have some state ownership, much higher levels of regulation, much larger welfare state, as you saw in that article by Alesina et al. In chapter 4 of the readings. The market's role is important. The market is still important here, right? It's not, the social democracies are not socialist economies. The basis is capitalism and a free market. It's just that there's a little bit more government regulation. Okay, communism, of course, is total state ownership. There's no, the role of the market is either, I mean, in classical communism, there is no market because there is no private property, right? That's the basis. A communist system is one in which there's no private property. And mercantilism is also sort of a lot of state ownership and a lot of state direction, a smaller welfare state in which the role of the market is more limited than it is in liberalism, in which the state really plays a very large role. And you've found this in Japan, especially in South Korea, and to a smaller extent in India. Okay, so once we've sort of now determined that there are different types of political economic systems around the world that are that treat the relationship between the state and the market differently, a common refrain as well, which of these systems is the best? Is the liberal sort of system of the United States, economic system of the United States, better at providing what it is that people want than is the mercantilist system of Japan or the social democracy of Sweden and other European countries? Well, how do we know? I mean, how can we gauge that? Well, a first sort of way of measuring or comparing political economic systems is to look basically just at GDP per capita, and that's gross domestic product. So that's the total amount of goods and services created in the country for a given year, divided by the population. So in the United States, it's very high. And here on the right-hand column, this is transferred into PPP, which is purchasing power parity in U.S. dollars. And basically, the reason that economists transform gross GDP or basic GDP into GDP PPP, purchasing power parity, is to give you an idea of the actual sort of level of well-being, right? Because this doesn't take into account without purchasing power parity, it doesn't take into account the actual cost of living in that country. So, for instance, you see that in Japan, which has a GDP per capita of $36,000 as of 2005. When you look at it, when you transform it into GDP per capita PPP, it's actually much smaller, and that's as a result of the fact that Japanese pay more for their goods and services. So their actual well-being is less than it would seem, given just the sort of the naked or the gross sort of amount of GDP per capita. So we see some countries are very rich and some countries are very poor, and but that's just sort of one way of looking at it, but of comparing. Now another way of comparing, right? I mean, GDP per capita, right, is just basically the average gross domestic product per capita, and that really doesn't tell you much about so all it does is it takes the total amount of goods and services produced in that country and then it divides it by the population.